Hello, Dr. Ibi.
Hello, Dr. Joe.
How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm just recovering from our latest spate of playing translation games, or games that we thought were going to be translation games, I suppose.
No.
Okie dokie.
We played two games recently that both had these translation mechanics in. Because, it's something we're both interested in, and I think we both found Heaven's Vault really, really fascinating in terms of what it kind of got you doing as you were playing, and how it used the language decoding to invest you in its world and all of that kind of stuff. It wasn't just that it was a language puzzle, it was that it was a language puzzle that showed the link between like deciphering a language and understanding history and a culture and stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And then we played Chants of Sennaar for a little bit.
We played that quite a while ago, actually. We played that maybe half a year ago.
Yeah, which is a beautiful game that is very well crafted.
We played it for a little bit, not for very long. We sort of gave up on it very quickly and then never did an episode about it because we weren't really sure what there was to talk about.
Yeah, and that one was a very well crafted game. It was this little top-down puzzle game where you walk around and you kind of talk to characters and they speak in speech bubbles that give you symbols, and then you decode what the symbols mean by reading from sort of like friezes, like tapestries and stuff
and we
like
can
that.
talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but so we played that a while ago.
Yeah, and that's one that I think I might go back to one day and play all the way through. I don't think it interested me. The reason we didn't do a whole podcast episode on it was there just wasn't as much to talk about, and I did go and spoil the narrative for myself by reading up on it.
Oh, did you?
So we can talk about that a little bit later on. So there will be some spoilers for Chants of Sennaar in terms of what the narrative is about, but I won't go into loads of detail, so you'll still be able to play it.
Yeah. And so very recently we played Sethian, which is another sort of language puzzle game.
From 2016.
Yeah, and I feel like it turns out that we had some feelings about Sethian that were very similar to our feelings about...
Chants of Sennaar.
Yeah, thank you.
Which I keep wanting to call Chants of Stendarr, but Stendarr is a god from the Elder Scrolls and not a...
And so the games they have similarities. They're also different in a lot of ways. But I think if we talk about sort of our experience playing those games, or at least from my experiences, what I was expecting is a language puzzle game that is engaging and interesting, and both of them fell a bit short for me, maybe for slightly different reasons. I think is sort of what we're going to talk about is like, what is it, what's going on with those games? Are they really language puzzles, and what does it need for a game that is supposedly a language puzzle to work?
Yeah. So I just want to describe the games first so people have a mental picture if they haven't played them before. So Sethian, I sort of described it before. You have this isometric top-down view that looks like an old school role-playing game like the older Baldur's Gates or something, but it's very beautifully coloured. It's very yellow, bright, hot colours. And most of the characters they're sort of without personality, really. They're all characters in hoods and stuff, which... feels like it's sort of a production constraint where they're trying to keep the amount of art assets down. You go and talk to them and they sort of go, woo, woo, and you get a speech bubble, and that's what they say. And then by learning what the individual glyphs in the speech bubbles mean, you can then navigate puzzles in the environment and turn things around and do all of this kind of physical puzzle stuff. And then it has some stealth shoehorned into it where you have to avoid certain characters in certain locations, which felt like it was doing video gamey stuff that took away from the language stuff. And then Sethian is very different from that, but it felt like it had some similar problems, right? So in Sethian, you're faced with a black screen with all of these alien glyphs on it, and this screen seems to be some sort of interface. You can click on glyphs and they will transfer from the right-hand side to the left-hand side. And there are some things about this language that you appear to be inputting into the interface, which you can kind of intuit. Like, for example, as you click on glyphs and try to type into it like it's a keyboard, it goes top to bottom rather than side to side. But then you quickly learn there's this journal that your player character is writing, and you can dip into it and it'll give you some initial clues. And it will kind of tell you what a couple of words mean so that you can type a query into the machine. So it sort of operates kind of like when we talked about interactive fiction, when we talked about the GOS stack before, we talked about link-based versus parser-based interactive fiction. And in parser-based interactive fiction, it's like you literally type in something like kick the dog, eat the apple, whatever.
Yeah.
And it tries to interpret that and do it in the game world.
Sethian is the same, only you don't know what the symbols mean.
Yes. Yeah. And you think...
And the symbols are also all like mathematical symbols. So you have different kinds of squares, triangles, circles, lines crossing in specific angles. So you literally, your input will be like hexagon, vertical line,
dot in the middle.
Venn diagram circles.
Yeah, the stylization of the language in Sethian feels like it's meant to evoke a robot language because it's so angular. And it's on a screen and you're interacting with what seems to be some sort of computer on the screen, like some sort of AI you're like an archaeologist. You've come to this place or planet, and the entire game is just you interacting with this AI computer thing in its own language and sending it questions and getting questions back. But the game sort of struggles because we weren't sure what was triggering it, but every so often you get a new journal entry. I wasn't sure if it was triggered by particular questions or just how long we'd been in the game or something.
Yeah, so before we get to that journal, I just want to quickly describe what I expected the game to be, which I think is important to figure out why, for me, it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And so I was expecting a language puzzle similar to the languagey puzzle bit in Heaven's Vault, where part of the player... The role of the player is to decipher the individual symbols, to decipher the meaning of sentences, to figure out what's going on in this world, right? And so when we started playing, I was sitting there with a piece of paper and a pen.
Like a good language game player.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Expecting to write down our guesses for what different symbols meant.
Yeah, and we were doing that for a good 15, 20 minutes.
Very quickly, what happens is that you have this in-game journal which has a little bit information at the beginning, and as you keep playing has more and more information.
Yes.
And it's this journal that's written by the character that you are playing, supposedly.
So it's like when you're playing an RPG and you've got a quest journal and the quest journal is written in the character's voice. So it's like, I found the goblins, I should go and punch them. Yeah. That kind of thing.
And so we would try out some things trying to guess what symbols meant, and suddenly we would get a new journal entry and it would read something, oh, I figured out that this and this meant this and this.
Yes.
Right? And sometimes that would confirm what we thought. And sometimes it would be information that we hadn't figured out yet, and it would tell us that. And then in my head I'm like, oh, why is this journal now telling me that I've figured this thing out, which I haven't actually figured out? And I am also I am the I in that sentence, you know? And then,
because the verb is, I've realised or I've deduced.
Yeah.
And we're used to having this weird split between ourselves and an avatar. But usually it's a recording of what they've done or what they felt about it, right?
Yeah.
I went to this place, I found this thing. And then if we're playing a very character-driven game like a Witcher or God of War, the character might have some independent feelings that they talk about in their journal. But it's not like I worked this thing out and the player doesn't know what the thing was.
Exactly.
You know?
And so what happens very quickly is... And again, we're not sure what exactly triggers it, but the journal will very quickly give you suggestions for combinations of symbols that it's saying you should input to get certain answers. And so I also looked into this a little bit more. Apparently, there is a very small number of suggestions between 20 and 20 and 20 and 30, I think, where if you, every time the journal tells you, okay, now try this phrase, you try it, you get a new answer, and then the journal tells you, oh, now try this other thing. Yeah. If you do this about 20 to 30 times, you actually get to the end of the game.
Yeah, so every journal entry you unlock contains in it clues, or sometimes just directly the answer for the next thing you should type in to unlock the next journal entry.
Yeah.
And if you're invested enough in understanding the characters and how they fit together to form words, you can understand, okay, I'm typing this query in, and then you can read the response and you can understand what it says as you gradually piece the language together. but you don't. But because the journal tells you what to type, you don't actually have to understand what you're saying,
Yeah.
right? So it's.
And then the other thing is that very early on, there's a part of the journal that's unlocked, which is the entire, basically, dictionary of all the symbols that the in-game character supposedly has figured out, where they tell you everything they figured out. And I think it's like, I don't know, about 100 symbols in total. And I was very surprised when suddenly that entire part of the journal unlocked, telling us all of the in-game character guesses for everything.
Yeah.
Even though we hadn't worked it out. And I remember sitting there and at some point like just throwing my pen and paper because I was like, this is...
Yeah, because it felt like in the first 20 minutes, it felt like the drip feeding that we were getting given was like an onboarding process of like, okay, this is a very difficult situation, right? Because the thing that makes this different from both Heaven's Vault and Chants of Sennaar is, even if we bounced off of Chants of Sennaar a little bit, you still test the language in a context that is like outside of language. So it's like you have a thought that these three symbols mean push the button, right?
Yeah.
And you go into an environment, you find the button and you push it, and then your idea about the language is confirmed when that does something, right? And it's the same in Heaven's Vault. It's like there are systems in place for just telling you, right, you know this word now.
Yeah.
But you're also testing the language in a context that is not just about referring the language to itself. Right? Whereas in Chants of Sennaar, you're talking in robotese to the robot, and there's no world outside of that. And so you're never testing the language against any other context.
I think you mean Sethian.
What did I call it?
The other one.
Oh, yeah, sorry. In Sethian, so they have very similar names. In Sethian, you're just communicating with the computer, and it's got no outside context to test or try that language in. And that makes it very, very... I'm not even going to say it's just that it's difficult. It's that it's unrewarding.
Yeah.
And that kind of makes it feel hard to feel motivated to get through it. And once you realise that the game is just telling you the answers, it basically becomes like... it's sort of how you would design an escape room if you were trying to design it for children. You would just tell them what to do each time they found a new thing. You would give them quite a reasonably direct instruction of what to do next. And that's not what an adult wants from an escape room. They want to have to do some lateral thinking.
Oh, you found a triangle-shaped key. Now go see whether there's a triangle-shaped hole anywhere in this room.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right? It feels like an escape room for children. It's unusual because it got some very, very good reviews.
Yeah.
Like on Itch, it was only, it was a small game at the time. It doesn't have loads of reviews, but it's like 4.5 stars on average. And I think some people enjoyed that process of being led through the diary and learning bits of the language, but not the game not being totally dependent on you understanding it to progress. I think people enjoyed that. But I think because we'd come at it after playing playing games that immersed you in a context so well, which Heaven's Vault does, and the Gostak does as well, right? With the Gostak, I didn't enjoy the Gostak, but I think it's good. Like I enjoyed being frustrated by it, and I thought, this is very, very clever, and I like what it's doing, and it works, right? I found it very frustrating and annoying, and I didn't want to play it all the way through. But I kind of generally think that was a good game. I don't feel like this really lives up to what it says it's about.
Well, yeah. So I am wondering, what actually is this game about? So it definitely is not what I was expecting, namely a game where we have to figure out this language, right? There was no point, it became obvious very early on, there was no point us trying to figure out what symbols meant, because the game, the in-game journal would tell us, right? And it probably, but also you need that in-game journal because the way that the game is structured, and I think there are two issues. It would be, you couldn't do what we did in Heaven's Vault, which is trying to figure out what all the symbols meant and then using that to communicate. I don't think that would be possible in Sethian for two reasons. One, there are too many symbols. There are many more symbols than there are in Heaven's Vault. And two, and you've talked about this a little bit, there is nothing to give you any clues about what anything means. In Heaven's Vault, you find an inscription, and it's, I don't know, it's on a dagger or whatever, right? and that the objects give you a clue about what might be
Yes.
on the object, what inscription might be on the object.
Yeah.
So you get information about the potential meaning from contextual clues of what kind of object is that, where did I find it, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas here, all you have is this inventory of about 100 or whatever geometrical forms. You can input questions, you get output questions from the same, in the shape of the same symbols. And if that was all there was, without the journal telling you what anything means, you'd have nothing confirming what anything
Right, yeah.
means. And there are no objects or entities that would confirm
Yes.
your translations, right?
Yeah, so it has a few problems. One is that, I feel like it sort of designed itself into this corner where it needed to have the journal because it would be too hard if it didn't.
Yeah.
But the reason it needed to have the journal, the existence of the journal takes away the whole idea of you are learning this conlang by deconstructing it or deducing what it means. But because there is nothing to test it against, there is a need for that mechanic. Maybe there was another way of potentially implementing it. But it also loses some of the stuff that I found appealing about, and it's maybe unfair to compare it too much to Heaven's Vault because it's different in scope, it's different in budget.
But we might compare it to the Gostak, for instance.
Yeah, the Gostak is a game of a similar scale. But the thing in Heaven's Vault is there's like a poetry to that language where you might learn the word for water and then you learn the word for rivers and then you learn that rivers in certain contexts aren't what we think of as rivers, they're something else. And you're learning about this big world, and the initial mechanic of like collecting objects with writing on, deciphering the language really hooks you into wanting to understand the bigger world and the lore of the world that you're in and that kind of pulls you through the translation thing. It like gives you the motivator, right? Like in a lot of games we have an immediate goal and then we have this idea of why am I doing this? Why am I as a player motivated to do this repetitive thing over and over again? I want to find out this or I want to get that or whatever. And the relationship between the history and the world in that game is what pulls you through. And I looked at the kind of spoilers for Chants of Sennaar and that feels like it does the same thing. You're immersed in a world and it's not quite the same, but there's at least a sense of like I'm here, there's some characters, there's a world going on around me. And this isn't just because those two games are graphical and Sethian is like this interface text-based game, because Gostak is completely text-based and Gostak immerses you in a sort of social world.
It has intrigue from the beginning, right? Because Gostak is also a parser-based game and it starts with this sort of descriptive prompt in gibberish English, which tells you that you are the Gostak and the Gostak distims the doshes, right? And so you're like, what the hell is a Gostak and what are doshes and why am I distimming them?
Yeah.
Right? And that's very little, but it's enough. At least it was for me. It was enough to want to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, it's impenetrable, maybe almost as impenetrable as Sethian is, but it positions you as a player character in a way that makes you want to understand the situation you're in, and that is maybe enough to hook people in and get them going.
Yeah, which I didn't get from Sethian at all. It's telling you as well in the beginning you are this researcher who's landed on this planet and there's no one else there, and basically you swore that you wouldn't go back home until you've managed to figure out what that language means.
I mean...
and then there was nothing that hooked me in, and just the fact that, and this, I don't know what, I can't really put my finger on what it is, but the fact that there is a journal written supposedly by my character telling me that they've done things that I myself as the player haven't done, which is working things out, I found that really off-putting.
Yeah, it feels like a problem that for any sort of game that is where the main thing you're supposed to be doing is deducing things.
Yeah,
right?
And maybe it's not. Maybe that was just a false expectation. Maybe that's not even what the game...
Well, I think one thing in its defence is that if you go all the way through the story in Sethian, you don't learn all of the language, right? It doesn't all get used. So that means there's this kind of possibility that there's this kind of short form story of you deciphering the basics of the language and working out some stuff about the computer and the world. And then there's this maybe broader metagame, which is kind of what happened with Heaven's Vault as well, of like, maybe you collaborate with some other fans of the game and you try and work out what the rest of the symbols mean. And the game doesn't really acknowledge that or need you to do it, but there is at least a bit of breadth there. It's just so impenetrable that it would require like group work to do, probably. And then I think some of this is like a development problem rather than one of intention, because I couldn't, like, I think if you design a constructed language and you set out to make a game about deciphering that, I don't think anyone who sets out to do that has their end goal of this kind of weak approach of using the journal. I feel like the journal is where you end up at when you can't make the deciphering based gameplay work, you know? And part of that is just maybe a lack of resources, a lack of being able to put anything visual, or again, to provide that outside
too complicated
context.
a symbol system to start out with, maybe.
I mean, all of the other three games we talked about all have a context to test the language in. You know, Heaven's Vault is very rich in context. Chants of Sennaar has a much simpler context of like, I am understanding these very simple verb the noun sentences so I can go around and do puzzles in the environment, but it's still a test context for the language. And then the Goth stack is text-based, but you are in a context and you have some of the, well, you didn't when you first play it, but you have some of the context of like how do parser-based games work, which is like the way the paragraph is laid out that says you are here, this passes by, there are exits to the north and south, and you can start to work out some words based on the conventions of the form it's in. This is alien in everything it's trying to do, including the interface, right? And if we had the same premise presented to us with different gameplay, like if it was the same idea, you're interacting with an alien computer, but it was presented as sort of like a Windows 95 interface, right? And I click into one folder and then I work out that symbol probably means pictures because that folder's got pictures in, right? There are so many ways that you can merge the learning or uncovering of a language with a context. But I think the minimalism of this game in its approach, which is probably a limitation of what the developer could do at the time or what they had time to do, probably led them in this direction of like having this linear story of this character deciphering the language and the player not really doing it, because for the player to be able to do it themselves, they need a context to test the language in. And a lot of that reminds me of the conversation we had about Duolingo and like gamifying language apps and how they tend to only teach you vocabulary because they're not putting you in a social situation where you have to use the language. They're just testing your comprehension of like sentences about nouns and verbs, you know?
And or there is a sort of lack of embeddedness in lack of embeddedness and sort of gameplay world that makes you want to go and discover more about the language, you know?
So I think in a roundabout way, I feel like the games that we've looked at and the order we've played them in maybe gives us a sense of like, what are the ingredients of a good game about deciphering a language, right? Well,
so, but before we go there, maybe I was wondering about whether you had any more thoughts on Chants of Sennaar, because we also started playing it and didn't finish playing that one, and we played that very close to when we finished Heaven's Vault. And in some ways it does similar things, but again, it didn't grip me.
So I quite like the puzzle design in Chants of Sennaar. I think if I'd have played it before Heaven's Vault, I would have really enjoyed it and found it very clever. I find the aesthetic of the game really appealing. But yeah, it's like there's a context in this game to test the language in. It's solving puzzles. It's once you know the language, you can maybe understand a bit of the history of the world you're in, and you can manipulate things in the environment and like understand what characters are telling you, because some of the characters are trying to help you. So they say stuff and you need to understand what they're saying in order to progress. But behind it all, it's a very sort of middle of the road science fantasy type situation. And that means if you're not there for that, then the sort of the intrigue underneath all of the learning the language and, you know, effectively it feels much more like a traditional video game where it's like, if I learn this new word so I can solve this puzzle, then I can go in this new room, right? And then I can talk to this character. It's very much like that. And from what I gathered from like spoiling the end of it for myself from the story, it just felt a bit like it's too kind of close to what you would expect it to be in terms of like, oh, it's Dune or it's Star Wars or something like that. And when I compare that to Heaven's Vault, Heaven's Vault has these very grounded human characters in a world that is quite weird in its like geography, in its kind of metaphysics or the beliefs that people have about that world and how it
But
works.
also from the very beginning you care. They make you care about the characters immediately. They make you care about Aaliyah and they make you care about the robot.
They introduce characters. They introduce like, maybe characters that you don't want to trust. They give you lots of sense of like, who do I trust in this world? Who's lying to me? All of this, a sense of stakes in the world for your character, other characters around you. And that makes the language part intriguing because it gives something for people to like lie about or disagree about. Whereas I think there is a little bit of that in Chants of Sennaar later on, and it feels a bit weird to be discussing it this much when I haven't played that far. But the story feels like much more of a rote standard fantasy thing.
Yeah.
And less about like people's disagreements about what things mean and stuff like that.
Well, if I try to think about, Heaven's Vault has a very clear initial hook that grabbed me. The Gostak did as well. If I'm trying to think what that was for Chants of Sennaar, I can't remember how it begins, which tells me either it doesn't have a hook or it doesn't have a very good one. Why am I that character in that world? What is it I'm even doing here?
Yeah.
I can't recall. And to me that suggests there's nothing in the game that makes me want to be that character and explore the world and learn that language.
They're a very kind of silent protagonist cipher character, like, Link in Zelda or something like that. And it's like, you are doing something important in that world, but you're not a character, you're just sort of like a player avatar.
Yeah, but it doesn't tell me that I'm doing something important, or it doesn't give me anything to go, ooh, I want to see where that leads me.
Yeah, that's true. It's sort of, you're thrown into a situation where you can't talk to anyone.
It's like, okay, I'm this little dude, I don't understand, I'm running around here. Who are these people? Why am I here? I don't even have a name.
Yeah. I think it's a very cool game. I just feel like playing it immediately after Heaven's Vault kind of spoilt it because of expectations from that. Like, this is what a game about deciphering a language is about, because it was, that was so rich in terms of the context that you're deciphering the language in. The language puzzle in Chants of Sennaar is interesting. It's like, it's got interesting rules to learn. Like, you learn a symbol when it's a noun, and it might be like the word for door, and then when you put door, it means doors and stuff like that. So there's all of those kind of little bits of language puzzle in there to chew on. And it just feels much more like playing a comic book than a novel, I guess. Everything is kind of very, the characters are literally just, they're kind of like characters in an old school JRPG like Pokemon, where a character is there in a marketplace or something, and they're just there to do one thing. They ask you for something, and then when you give it to them, they give you a key. They're not characters beyond that. They're just little dudes that have like one line to say and that kind of thing. Yeah, I like it. I will probably go back and play it at some point, but I feel like it was just a bad order to play those games in. And it did very well. It got lots of award nominations and so on. But it's a very pretty game. It's a really nice game to look at.
Did it come out after Heaven's Vault?
Yeah, 2023. It's very recent. So I guess my take on all of this is, if people are listening to this podcast and they haven't played any of these games,
don't play Heaven's Vault first.
Don't play Heaven's Vault first. Play Chants of Sennaar first. Play the Gostak, because it will only take you... Well, you'll know whether you want to try and complete it within about 20 minutes of starting it. And play Heaven's Vault the last, because it will just ruin all the others for you if you play it too early. Which is what happened with us, I think. Which is just a general thing that can happen with any genre of games.
I don't think that's necessarily true, because it didn't spoil the Gostak for me, because the Gostak is still good.
Yeah. And the Gostak is such a singular experience in terms of like the amount of times I just burst out laughing. Because I would type a thing in, and I would be like, okay, I've worked out this new thing I'm going to say, go over there and do that. And I know exactly what this sentence means. And then the response that would come back from the parser was just like, had so many new words in, and I just look at it and think like, what?
Yeah.
You know, and it was exactly that experience of like you go to France and you haven't spoken French in 10 years.
You've managed
And-
how to say, can I please have a coffee?
Yeah,
And then suddenly they ask you what kind of milk
Yeah,
you want, and they
yeah.
list all the
And you're
milks
like,
and you don't
And
understand.
you're like, I get the gist of that. I understand that it was a response to the question, can I have some coffee? But there are so many words in that. Yeah, you spent like 3 minutes in the taxi constructing the sentence, do you have change for like 50 in your head? And you think you're really smart because you say that and you say it. And then the thing you get back is just like, I do not. It evokes that really, really well. And Sethian does a fair bit of that, but it's just not fun when it happens. You know, and I think some of that is an input problem because when the game comes back to you and says this thing that you don't understand, and you look at it and you think, well, I don't understand 90% of that. I know what that symbol means, and then you've got to like click through this horrible interface. Like in Sethian, it's like you've got your set of characters, like a 4x4 grid, or maybe it's bigger, and I'm like clicking one of those and then going onto a different page to put the next one in, and then going back to the first page to put the next one in, and that is so arduous, and it's just like. And this is the thing with game design. There can be like one good idea in a game, and the way that it's framed or the way the interaction is designed can like ruin it in some way because, you know, these are games that are about being able to quickly experiment and iterate through your theories about what words mean.
Yeah.
And if you introduce loads of friction in terms of like, how do I input words, then that's going to be a problem because every other game that we've played of this is about being able to just quickly try something out and see if that works. And Sethian introduces this friction, which is like trying to serve this fiction of you being the archaeologist sat at this magical ancient computer. And it should immerse you, right? And it does initially immerse you in this idea of like, I'm interacting with this weird alien computer. But it doesn't immerse you in the process of deciphering the language because it makes the feedback loop too long and involve too many clicks.
Yeah.
In some ways, if they put the entire language, that horrible, massive 100-character language, if they put the whole thing in a 10 by 10 grid and let us just click them, that would have
like a little keyboard, right? Yeah.
That would have. I mean, it wouldn't have solved the problems we had with it, but it would have made them smaller, I think. Because you're thinking of like clicking backwards and forwards between these different screens, and it's like I'm trying to put these 5 characters in because I know how to write, you know, who are you or something like that, and clicking to the next screen and back every time I need to change character is like, you know, multiplying the amount of clicks I need to do by about 400, 500%.
Yeah, and then you have to remember, which page was that on again? Go to page 2. No, it was page 3. Where is it? It's
like,
very
you know,
cumbersome.
physically flipping backwards and forwards through a phrase book to find totally unrelated words because, you know, you've gone to a restaurant and they don't serve normal restaurant food, so you're having to go to the jungle animals section and find out what a crocodile is called or something like that.
Yeah.
It is interesting. I find all of this stuff fascinating because it's a relatively small genre of game, and it's a thing that I've seen used in games in the past. Like it's very common that we'll have a big RPG like a Bethesda game or something, and you go in a dungeon and there's some symbols on the wall and you have to work out what they mean, right? There's micro puzzles within big fantasy games that rely on this idea of like, oh, we're going to just invent 5 words of this conlang and then you solve a puzzle. And like I think I told you before, Ultima Underworld, which I think came out in about 1990 or maybe even before that, there's a puzzle in that you've got characters, you go up and you speak to them and it describes the conversation to you because it's in text. So it'll say the man does this, and there's a bunch of lizard men living in this particular place and they have a human prisoner and they've cut his tongue out. And you use him to try and understand the lizard's language. But you go up to the lizards and you can't understand them. And they'll say the lizard hisses and then does this, that, and the other. You go back to the man with his tongue cut out and tell him the words and he'll mime what the word means. So you're sitting taking notes. This is like, I would have been about 8 or 9 when I played this. And so it's something that we've had a precedent for in games, like going way back. And I don't know if the idea of making an entire game about learning a language is a relatively new thing. But it's surprising that it's still such a small category of games.
Yeah, it's because it's such a particular kind of puzzle game. And first of all, you have to create a whole overall system of a language that works, right? Which is, I assume, more difficult than just designing a bunch of individual puzzles, right?
Yeah. Well, no, I think what comparing these games has shown is that maybe the language and the construction of the language isn't as important as the way the player gets to interact with that language. Because I think if we were testing the language of Sethian in the context of one of the other games, we probably would have learnt it, even if it has more characters.
Maybe, yeah.
But the process the game gives you in order to try the language out is the thing. I mean, it's going to be all of these things like linked together. It's like a systems versus content type question.
Yeah, but yeah, and it's interesting in at least Chants of Sennaar, Heaven's Vault, and Sethian, that there are certain things that they are doing with the symbols to indicate certain patterns of how they use symbols in all of those constructed languages. So one thing is like if you have a symbol that denotes an object, and then if you have a plural, like they just use that symbol twice, is a very common one. And then we have also, in most of them, you can have the same symbol or the same combination of symbols in the case of Heaven's Vault, denoting either a verb or a noun. And whether it's a verb or a noun depends on either like a grammar category marker that's attached or the position of where that symbol is. So they're simplifying it by having you have drink as the verb and the noun, whereas in most real languages that's not always the case, right?
Yes, and that serves a couple of things.
Eat and food. You don't food your food, and you don't eat your eat.
Yeah, but and that serves a couple of things, right? It makes the language simpler and has less parts.
Yeah.
And it also makes it fun because it makes it slightly different. So we have to work out the rule, right?
Yeah.
And that becomes a fun part of learning.
But
the
it
language.
means you have to come up with fewer words or symbols for the language, right? And you give the player a pattern to work out.
Yeah. But this is what good design is. It's when you merge the constraints that you, as the creator of the thing, have with the needs that the player has to make the thing fun, right? So if you can find a way that you have to make up less symbols, and that makes the game easier and it makes the game more fun, because one of the things that's amusing about deciphering one of those languages is that the language has quirks to it that aren't the same, and we know that they have Heaven's Vault works around the kind of conceit that the word order is exactly the same as English, right? The way that the individual words are constructed, it has its own strange rules that are alien to us.
Yeah.
But once you know what the words are and you put them in the right order, it's an English sentence, right?
Yeah.
Which is not how languages usually relate to each other, especially when they're not in the same family of languages.
I think Chants of Sennaar is all subject, verb, object as well. And they are all the sentences are in general simpler than in Heaven's Vault.
Yeah. The pattern across all of them as well is the simple concept, simple shape as well, which is one of those things that just makes intuitive sense when you think of like keyboard ergonomics and stuff like that, of like when we develop a way of writing a language, if there's something we're going to write more frequently, we're going to make that an easy thing to write, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of makes sense. And then there's some degree of like it's kind of like the Kiki Baba thing of the signification through the shape.
Yeah.
There's some of that going on. So in Sethian, round circles generally talk about beings, or you or I, and squares talk about things, right? So there's a thing where there's like
I think that's true.
It's not true all the way through.
Yeah.
But the first set of like 4 things, all of the round ones were to do with beings or like personhood.
I mean, all the symbols are weird geometrical symbols, and they are way less intuitive than the symbols that we see in either Heaven's Vault or Chants of Sennaar, which are much more iconic.
Yes,
right?
Yeah, like
you have
something
a wavy
that means
line for
water,
water,
like,
which you don't have in Sethian in the same way.
Yes. That's kind of like a clue that makes it fun to guess. It's also a fun thing to do from a design perspective, because you get I don't know if it's a general idea in language learning, but I remember at school they used to refer to them as false friends, like words that sound like they have the same meaning but they don't mean the same thing.
Yeah.
It's because it phonetically sounds like another word in English, so you think,
well, that means that, and it doesn't.
And they can kind of play around with that, because they can give you the clues early on and say, okay, water is a wavy line. So you go, okay, in this language, things are what they look like. But that means that later on in the game, you can break that, and you can have things that don't relate to the shape of the shape of the grapheme in the way that you would think.
Yeah.
And that's neat. I just think that's neat. So, I feel like we have a list of recommendations when it comes to this game, these kind of games, but it's more a list, like an order of what order to play them in.
Yeah.
And I don't think Sethian is a terrible game, but I think if you were going to play all these games, you should play Sethian first, because it's like someone holding your hand while they play one of these games and explain it to you. And then, Sethian first, Heaven's Vault last, Gostak and Chants of Sennaar somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
That's like a nice ramp of these games and what they do. And I really think Sethian is just a product of like how small it is, and having less time or resources as a developer just means you can't provide the context to test that language in, which is what makes all of the other games interesting. That if you don't have a context to test the language in, it's like you're learning a language by just doing Duolingo, and you're never engaging with the language outside of that app. It's just on its own.
Yeah, but you're also
pocket.
Sethian is like, imagine you are learning Duolingo,
And then
a language you don't know, but there is no image of a fish with the word fish in the other language. It's just the word fish, and it doesn't tell you anything else. And just from seeing the word, you have to figure out what it means.
Yeah, and every so often, Duo the owl pops up dressed as you and says, "Today I learned all about fish."
All about
You go, "No, I didn't."
Yeah.
No, I didn't. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wouldn't recommend this game, but I think it's still an interesting experiment, and I feel like if you're interested in conlangs and like making games in this genre, I think this one shows you where the limits are of like when does it stop being fun.
Yeah.
And like it by the absence of some of the ingredients that the other games have, really kind of highlight why they are needed in a game about learning a language, and or a game about the kind of the deductive process of deciphering a language.
Yeah. But also, if any of you out there have played Sethian and you think we are wrong and we're missing the point and it's a great game, please let us know.
Yeah, please do.
I would really like to hear if people really enjoy it and what it is they enjoy about it, because for me it just didn't work. But again, part of that might have been what I was expecting it to be.
Yeah, and like I could imagine people really enjoying Sethian if it was the only language game they'd played. So I'd be interested to hear from people that like Sethian and also liked these other games, and how you kind of relate them to each other, because I feel like the order we played these in were really, really kind of had a very strong effect on our experience of each one.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
Thank
you very much. Thanks for listening. This is Say It Like You Play It, a podcast about games, languages, and culture.
You can listen to us on all main podcasting platforms or on YouTube. We also have some footage of us playing Sethian, actually, which we might throw on the old YouTube as well for you to watch if
us
you
being confused for 20 minutes.
That is
trying to work out what the game is playing itself.
Yeah.
Please, whatever platform you listen on, if there's a way of leaving a review and you like the podcast and you want it to continue, please do that. If you are listening to the YouTube version of this, please subscribe to the channel, do a like, all of that kind of stuff. And thank you for listening, and see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
No.
Okie dokie.
Let's get it, what it do.